請勿靠近車門。
請不要靠近車門。
Please stand back from the doors.
Hello and welcome back to What Kind of Asian Are You podcast, a podcast featuring conversations about being Asian. I am your host. My name is Kyle. If you want to continue supporting this podcast, just continue listening to us and share this with your friends and family. In addition to that, please consider subscribing to us on your streaming platform and leaving us a rating on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and leaving a review on Apple Podcasts as well. Those really help grow the podcast so that we could bring in more interesting and amazing guests that you want to hear from. And now to today's guest. This guest is someone that I previously interviewed on my other podcast, Never Jaded, with my co-host Robin. We had a good time talking there, and I brought this person to this podcast because we wanted to talk about something that we didn't cover on the Never Jaded podcast. And I'll leave the show links for that episode in the description below. I will also be leaving a first few minutes of that episode on this episode so you can have a little teaser of what we did there and come back to our conversation here with more kind of context. And our guest today is Ben Aqua. They are a content creator, photographer, artist, musician, just very talented. Ben wanted to talk about being Asian and how that relates to his art, and we talked a lot about that and also everything related to his craft, and I think this is a very good one that you will really enjoy. So without further ado, here is the episode.
You're now tuned in to Never Jaded Podcast, giving flowers to Asian creators. I'm your host Robin.
And I'm your other host Kyle. Join us as we get inspired by artists, creatives, and entrepreneurs from all walks of life. And remember everyone, never jaded, always motivated. Let's get creative.
Never jaded, always motivated. It's your boy Robin, and we're back with a brand new episode of the Never Jaded Podcast. I'm joined by my co-host, Kyle. How's it going, brother?
I'm doing great. Another week, another podcasting session with Robin. Things can't get better. I mean, I'm loving it.
I'm very excited for today's episode. You know, I know I say that every week, but I'm actually pretty excited for today's episode because, Kyle, you know me for a while, right?
Yeah. You
know me since the beginning as an Apple guy, right?
Yeah.
I've only been an Apple guy. My first smartphone was an iPhone, and I've never even touched a BlackBerry. I've never touched an Android phone in my life, you know? Your boy's a Mac for life. But this year, I was very close to switching sides. Kyle, I was very close because my old MacBook, my 2012 MacBook was finally giving out, right? And it was time to switch over. And I was like, I don't know if I want to spend that much money on another MacBook, man, you know? So I almost switched sides this year, Kyle. You know what I mean? But I was like, you know what? Maybe I'll do some research, you know, like I'll watch a couple videos, you know, see what's out there, you know? Maybe there's something that might fit my needs, right? And I randomly stumbled onto our guest today's channel on YouTube, and I bought my current M1 Mac Mini off one of his reviews. So I was like, this guy, I loved his videos. I followed him, you know what I mean? And I found that like he does other cool stuff as well. So like, I thought, I was like, this person is great fit for Never Jaded. So I just reached out, and they were down, so I'm very excited. Kyle, let's just bring this person in so we can talk to them, okay? Welcome to the show, Ben Aqua. How's it going?
Greetings, Earthlings. Welcome to this conversation. It's going pretty well. I feel very hydrated, and I just had like a gigantic salad, so like I'm ready. I'm ready to do this.
Ben,
Yeah.
thank you so much for agreeing to do this. I'm very excited to talk to you. Thank you for your recommendations now that I have a sweet Mac that I can do my stuff on. You know what I mean?
So let me ask you this.
Okay.
How is the Mac working out for you? Like, was my recommendation accurate? Was it okay?
I love
Do you
it.
like it?
I love it. Mac One, like affordability, right? And in terms of like the power and processing speed, everything I need, you know, best bang for my buck, you know, just as you said in your video. So thank you so much for that.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm it's weird. I kind of want to like open up my videos like, hello, welcome to the Apple Store. My name is Ben. Can I help you? Because like I've just by making these Mac videos, I've like accidentally become like tech support for Apple somehow.
That's amazing. That's amazing.
You saying that just make me want to ask one question, like, what got you started being such an Apple fanboy? Like, how was your experience with your first Apple product? Let's start with that.
Mm-hmm.
Damn, what was it? I think my first Apple product, was it the iPhone? No, I don't even think the iPhone was out yet. So I had like an old MacBook. I think it was just called MacBook. Do y'all remember like the white MacBook laptop from, I don't even know, 2009?
Yeah.
Or both, or even before that, something like that. But I never used Mac until I went to college. So I went to the University of Texas in Austin, and I always thought Mac was just like way out of my league. It was too expensive, you know, like only the professionals use it, you know, like that kind of stuff. So as like a really just frugal teenager, I was like, I can't afford that. So, but then when I went to school, I suddenly had access to like all these really expensive computers that were way faster, way prettier than any of the crappy like PC towers that I, you know, like Dell, whatever. I don't even know, like Gateway computers or whatever. So yeah, I used them and I was just like, wait a minute, like this interface it doesn't like crash like ever. And like who knows what even version of Mac that was, and what, you know, the old I don't even know if they were called iMacs at the time, but you know, that was like the early 2000s. So that kind of started this like weird obsession that I'm still riding that wave today, apparently. And it's really like, since I've been doing my YouTube channel, like the Apple stuff like goes crazy. Like there's people that are just ready for the Apple content, you know, way more so than almost anything else that I've covered, like camera stuff, music related stuff. Like I think people are like, oh, that's cute, but can you talk more about the MacBook? You know. So that's kind of the quick rundown. Yeah.
Hi, Ben. How are you doing today?
Hey, Kyle. I'm good.
Again, I really want to thank you again for doing this podcast, because you were on Never Jaded podcast earlier, my other podcast that I do with my co-host Robin, and we really had a fun time there. We talk a lot about your journey in the creative arts and all that fun stuff. So if people want to check that out, definitely do so. But the reason I got you back on this podcast is because you mentioned something after the fact where you're like, oh, you guys didn't really talk about a certain aspect of my life that I thought you guys were probably gonna touch on. Do you want to just let the audience know what exactly that you mentioned that sparked this kind of recording today? Do you remember?
Yeah, I think I remember after the recording. It was just like an observation. I was like, oh yeah, we didn't really talk about like being Asian and like the Asianness and how that crossed over into, you know, my creative work or anything like that. And I guess it wasn't like a bad thing or anything, or a criticism. I was more just like I guess I kind of prepped myself in my head a little bit, being on like an Asian podcast, like answering like Asian centric questions. But it was actually a little refreshing to like not go there, even though it's definitely like a huge part of my identity, obviously. And it was just an observation. It was just something I noticed. I had a lot of fun just talking about all that other stuff too, where I didn't even think about it till the end.
Yeah. And I guess my question now is like, do you get those kind of Asian questions a lot in your other like kind of appearances on either like press, media and stuff? Is that why you were like priming yourself to be like, oh, I'm going to probably have to talk about that side of my life or identity?
Not at all, actually, unless it's something like directly related to being Asian, like this art show that I was in Austin, Texas, where I live, where it was specifically at it's called the Asian American Resource Center. So like all of it had to do with being Asian and like kind of my where I feel like I am in my community in Austin and stuff. I think sometimes people are kind of afraid to ask unless they're like Asian, or I'm half Korean, unless they're like Asian themselves, to like ask me something about my Asianness. So like it usually won't even come up. I think, people want to be sensitive, and like I think I respect that, but also I'm like, I'm cool with talking about it. If people want to ask me stuff, as long as it's respectfully done. So,
Well,
yeah.
I'm glad to hear that. And with my podcast, I like to ask a lot of my guests like about their background, not necessarily their Asianness or whatever, just their background, their story. And so, with you, let's start from the very beginning. I like to ask this question to all my guests: is like, what kind of Asian are you? And we'll go from there.
Yeah. Still trying to figure it out, Kyle.
Mm.
No, I'm half Korean. My mom was Korean, from South Korea, and my father was Caucasian, and so I'm a mutt, I guess you could say. But my dad was also very Jewish, so like I'm a very like bizarre mutt of like Korean and Jewish.
Okay. And I guess, were you raised in a household where both culture were kind of put into, or it was kind of one more dominant than the other? I always wonder with that, with like mixed households, like is there a balance, or usually one is more dominant than the other?
Yeah, I would say it was leaning more towards Jewishness actually. Like my brother and I have an older brother, and we both had bar mitzvahs. We went to synagogue when we used to live in New York and New Jersey. We grew up basically like a Jewish household, but there were certain things like that my mom would definitely integrate into that. She did a lot of Jewish cooking too. She learned a lot of like matzo ball soup, kind of like traditional Jewish recipes. But my mom, since she was like an amazing cook, she would always make Korean food, and she spoke to us in Korean. I wouldn't say we really went to a lot of like Korean cultural events. Like once in a while, I would go to, my mom's Korean church wherever we lived, because we lived in like New York, New Jersey, Mississippi, and then we made it to Austin. So kind of throughout that journey, it was mostly Jewish and then some Korean stuff like here and there. So yeah, I guess it was always just kind of like, who am I? Like was a question that I still kind of ask myself, like, am I Korean? Am I Jewish? Am I both? And it kind of just like my upbringing, it kind of just goes back and forth, almost based on my mood sometimes. Or sometimes I'm like, yeah, hell yeah, I'm Korean. I'm Korean as hell today,
Yeah.
And other times I'm like, I'll do something like kind of Jewish or whatever. So yeah,
That's
kind of a
great.
good balance.
Yeah. So you mentioned like you were born in New York, or I read somewhere you were born in Brooklyn. Is that correct?
Yeah,
Oh,
Brooklyn.
so you were born in New York, Brooklyn, and then you moved around a bit. And did you feel like during that kind of childhood where you moved around a bit, you mentioned that you didn't get necessarily a lot of like Korean cultural stuff, but did you feel like your mom kind of made sure that you had a sense of like, oh, even though your father is Jewish, I'm Korean, you still need to know kind of like, oh, both sides kind of thing? Or it was very much that whole kind of immigrant mentality of like assimilation, or like you gotta be as similar to what everyone else it was at that point in your life?
Yeah, I would say my parents leaned more, especially my mom, leaned more towards the assimilation thing. I don't think she had like necessarily like shame or like, fear of certain things happening. I think it was more just like we live in America, you might as well be, mostly American. So she did speak, I spoke a little Korean. My brother and I spoke a little Korean as kids. Apparently, we would speak in like full Korean. I don't remember that, but apparently, we both knew how to speak it. I can still speak a little bit, but it's kind of like baby talk style, like nothing super fancy. But no, it's weird because I can't remember any times where I ever heard like a conscious decision from my parents, like them kind of discussing like, hey, should we do this more Korean style, or should we do this kind of Jewish style or American style or whatever? But it always just kind of went back to just like American kind of style of life, My brother and I were very American in a lot of ways, and I seem to remember just like certain instances where
if my mom wanted to do something kind of Korean, my brother and I would be like, no, we want to do the American thing. It wasn't so much like their pressure on us, but it was kind of more like, for me at least, a kind of self-imposed pressure that if I wasn't American enough, like people would make fun of me or tease me, which I still got teased anyway, so it kind of backfired. But yeah, I guess it was more like a self-assimilation, and my parents were more just kind of cool with whatever we wanted to do. But I did appreciate the bits and pieces where, things were kind of Korean sometimes and then Jewish sometimes, especially the Korean stuff. Some of the Jewish stuff is a little harder for me because it was more about the religion part of it. And that's never really been like a huge influence in my life, this kind of spiritual side of Judaism, but, or I guess the organized side of it. So yeah, I kind of feel more Korean, I guess, than Jewish, if that makes sense.
That makes sense. And I think a lot of times with like, at least from what I've seen, or people I talk to that are mixed, usually with Asian, with any other kind of ethnicity, it's always like, I feel I was more a certain way at the beginning of my childhood and then grow up into more American or anything. It's never really like, I feel leaning towards not the non-Asian side. It's always because either the mom influence or whatnot, but as you grow older, then you kind of find your way, and eventually either you go the other way or like you whereas like you feel more Korean and such. A lot to do with your mom, obviously, I would say, but like continuing about like your childhood and stuff. So how were you as a child, like with like being mixed and during your time is like, you moved around a lot. I assume like being mixed, you probably the one of rare few in your area that's like, you're mixed, let alone Asian as well. So can you just talk about that?
Yeah, I mean, I had honestly just kind of like a tortured childhood. Where I just never, again, like I never really felt like I was something that was easily digestible by, anyone around me, including my friends who were just like, I don't get what's going on here. Like I was teased a lot, I was bullied here and there. So like my childhood was a little bit tortured. Not so much. My parents were like super supportive. It was mostly just like people, especially in the New Jersey area for some reason. Like in New York, I was such a little kid. I moved away from there when I was like 6 or 7 years old to New Jersey. But it was in the New Jersey area where I was like just like ridiculed like crazy. I think people were like just so like they couldn't figure me out. Just visually, they didn't know like, are you Asian? Are you Hispanic? Are you white? Like, what is happening? Like some people even thought I was Hispanic just based on my looks. And there was just a lot of confusion. So I retreated a lot. And I just like dug really deeply into my work, into my creative work. Like that's when I started like drawing cartoon characters and comic books. I got really into comics and comic like cards and trading cards, baseball cards, stuff like that. I kind of just like retreated into a lot of my creative hobbies. And then I just realized it felt a lot safer than trying to like, not safer, but it just felt more like meaningful than trying to explain to other people who I was when I wasn't even sure of that myself, if that makes sense. So I did find a tribe of like some friends that were like, mostly actually Asian, just very diverse friend group actually in New Jersey, who we just wanted to play basketball and trade, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtle cards or whatever. Like we weren't interested in like being like, hey, let's talk about our ethnicities and how, like the nuances of our behavior and how we're raised. Like it was very just like fluid in some ways. So yeah, it was a little bit tortured, but I think that helped me kind of get to a place where I just kind of owned it after a while. Like it was a challenge. I like a good challenge. And even back then I was just like, what? I don't want to just be like depressed and sad all the time. And even as a little kid, just like, who am I? Like, who should I be? Should I be more Asian or white or whatever? It was more just like, I just have to embrace and practice embracing the mixed part of it and just let it be whatever it is. And also let it be kind of shape shifting, like let it morph and evolve over time. And I'm still like, I have a much kind of, I guess I have more like confidence in being kind of like an alien in this world. And I think about it more like a superpower now. I think it's like, it's kind of a blank canvas. Like I just learned from that, really early age that like, if I don't make that up for myself, no one's going to like people will try to give me this identity. I'm not going to accept that. and I'll do. I have to be me, you know. And I still feel like I have to kind of practice that because people still don't know who the hell I am, and I don't really know who I am either, to be honest. So
yeah, like I always
you can help me figure it out.
this.
Kyle.
Yeah, like I always mention on this podcast, like it's a lifelong journey. It doesn't stop. Like you won't find exactly one answer for this kind of like who am I or where do I fit in, that kind of thing. And it's okay as long as you kind of keep moving around, figuring it out. You'll get there eventually. And if you don't, it's fine as long as you live your best life, kind of thing. And you talk about embracing and like be owning it and that kind of stuff. It seems like you did a certain level of that, obviously not to the full extent of embracing when you were a child and growing up and stuff, but when you were saying like you embraced it at that point, what did that mean? Like how or was there a spark that be like, yes, I'm embracing it, I'm okay with it, to the best point at that point? Like I want to know, like what did that mean to you at that point, meaning to embrace?
I think it was just like kind of looking within, and just like looking at myself in the mirror and just letting myself be who I was, instead of kind of like what you're saying, instead of just like putting myself into a box or into other people's boxes. I think it was just a lot of just like staring at, I mean, I didn't like, I'm kind of speaking more metaphorically. I didn't like stare at myself in the mirror, like, who am I? A little bit. I did a little bit of that, but like, it was mostly just like that kind of just introspection, that sense of self, like really thinking like, okay, who authentically am I? What am I really into? What really pleases me? Does it please me to be put into categories? Hell no, you know? So what can I do instead? Well, I will create my own category and I will experiment with maybe the way I dress. You know, I mean, you can see how I dress still now. I've always kind of dressed kind of cartoony and kind of clown like. I never wanted to wear what other people were wearing. I never wanted to kind of talk how other people were talking. And even like the music I listened to, I listened to like really, I guess for a young, 9 or 10-year-old, I was listening to like punk music and a little heavy metal and some rap music and stuff, just influenced from my older brother and stuff. And just like going to these punk shows actually was like a huge influence on me, because this community of, I was going to these shows at like 11, 10 years, 11, 12 years old. And I was like, oh my God, these people are really talking about, like, screw everyone else that tries to put you in a box. Just be you. You have to be you. So I think like the punk community actually, which was really vibrant in New Jersey, especially for whatever reason, and like these suburbs of New York, the punk rock community was just like super supportive, and and they were addressing racism in ways that I'd never seen before. They were being like, this is not cool. You don't judge other people, like leave other people alone. It had this kind of attitude, and it really kind of fired me up to kind of hone in on myself. But then, I had to take that and kind of do my own work, and I'm still doing that. But weirdly, the punk community just like really embraced that diversity that I was really striving for.
That's great. And you mentioned a lot like, how the punk community helped you to embrace, along with, of course, like, being creative. So can we just talk a little bit about that? So you said you started off being like drawing and all that stuff. So with being creative, were you like thinking, I'm really good at this, I want to pursue this later on? Or it was just always like, I just like doing it? Were there ever a point during like that time of like using it to like, feel better and all that stuff? It was like, this could be a career, because right now you're a multi-talented, multimedia kind of artist and musician and all that stuff, which we'll get on to later. But like, I'm just wondering, like, did you always feel like art or like creative kind of industry is what you wanted to do all along?
Kind of. I mean, I definitely, when I was a kid, drawing these comic book characters and stuff, I don't think I was like super aware like this could be my career. I think I admired a lot of like illustrators, comic book artists. Like Jim Lee was like one of my top influences at the time, and just like a bunch of other comic book artists and stuff. But I guess I pictured myself being like, I could, like, that would be really cool to be able to do this for a while. But I think for me, it was more kind of an emotional and just like creative outlet. It was like the one area of life that I seemed like I could actually control. I couldn't control other people's racism and their intolerance and their weird comments and stuff. So instead, I'd go home and just draw comics for like 8 or 9 hours, And I guess I never really considered it like a career or something that I could do or just keep on doing, really until I just got feedback from my parents and from my friends and stuff. There's like, oh, whoa, you're like pretty good at this or whatever. Like I didn't really have self-confidence, and I was like, oh, okay, whatever. But I guess I got enough comments, and I realized that I could get so deeply into that zone where almost nothing could penetrate me. Nothing could penetrate the zone. And there was something really like just, yeah, there's just something amazing about that. I didn't really have that in a lot of other ways. And I just realized I could focus like crazy for so long and just keep doing it, and like miss meals and that kind of stuff. I can still do that. And I think that's part of like the superpower. Maybe it's like, okay, well, the world doesn't know what the hell I am. I'm going to make it up. So I just kind of made up this reality of creating these comic book characters. It got to a point where I was like collaborating with friends and drawing our own comics with them. And we were selling little illustrations that we made, where people would be like, hey, I'll give you like $1 if you draw a Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtle on this napkin. I'll be like, yeah, sure. So I did some of that. So I guess I was like, I don't know, I was like naturally, I guess, kind of entrepreneurial. But I also think that was a little bit my upbringing too. Like my dad was very much about like business and succeeding and, do it yourself. Like don't wait for other people, start your own business. Like he kind of instilled that in us from a very age, my brother and I. So I think the cross section of that and just being able to focus for so long and then getting that feedback made me think, oh, wait a minute. I think maybe I'm an artist. I think art is actually really cool. And I don't feel like judged here. I feel like I'm kind of embraced by the community with art. So yeah, it's still kind of stuck with me until this day, which is pretty cool.
That's
but
great.
It's definitely not like a plan though.
Yeah, for sure. And
Yeah.
it's great that you started off like just drawing comic books, characters and all that stuff. So, but how did that transition to like the other mediums that you take part in now, like from like just photography to graphic design to music as well, and now to like video creating?
Yeah, it all just kind of happened together, except I didn't really have access to any visual tools other than like, like a pad and a pencil and some colored pencils and stuff at the time. But like the video thing came much, much later. I never really thought, I was kind of intimidated by photography and video. I was interested in it. I thought films and TV shows are beautiful, but that came much, much later. Like that was like when I got into college, really. But it was mostly like the drawing. I loved to draw, and then I also loved making music, or I think it was through going to those punk shows and stuff. Like I love that raw energy, and I was like, I could do that. I was listening to like Nirvana and Weezer and stuff.
Foo Fighters.
I was like, Foo Fighters, hell yeah! When I was like 10 years old, that was like my stuff, and I listened to all kinds of punk music and stuff too. And I think I got my first guitar when I was like 10 or 11, and I think it was like maybe $5 or $10 from a pawn shop. It was like the crappiest guitar ever, but I was like, I'm gonna learn how to play this, and like I was like not good at it, but I would just make up my own songs, and that it just kind of came naturally. And I realized that music and drawing were like two things, like I said earlier, how I could just focus and zoom in on it for like a really long time. So I just kind of followed that. But yeah, the video, like YouTube and that kind of stuff came way later. That was like into my 30s when I like really started doing YouTube. But in college and stuff is when I started doing photography. And I just really like the challenge of it, like learning a new medium, seeing if I can just, how my drawing skills or music skills or whatever, how that could translate into other mediums. I like that a lot. And I still do. I still like to experiment a lot.
That's great. And
yeah,
all the kind of creative mediums that you take part in, I see like they kind of don't like relate in a sense, obviously.
Yeah.
But I think what I want to ask is like, is there one kind of over like big message that you want to get out with all your art? Like, what do you want to express through them? Like the content itself, it could be anything, but like what do you want people to get from the stuff that you create from each of these different medium? Is there different objectives, or it's all the same thing for you?
Damn, it's hard. I don't know if there's one thing. I do love to challenge people though. So I think that may be one of the overarching kind of goals. With my YouTube stuff, it's different because it's a lot of it's like educational or just like entertainment. But I think with my music and with some of my visual art and some of my photography and stuff, it seems like one of the big themes is challenging the viewer to kind of stop what they're doing and think a little bit differently, or think outside of their own box, or maybe step inside of a different world, or into someone else's shoes and be like, wow, this is so different. I want to try to figure this out, or I want to see what this sparks for me. And, just, I guess, kind of embracing kind of the alienness again of my aesthetic. Like a lot of my music, it's hard to define. Like we talked about that in the other podcast. I don't even know how to define it, because it just comes out, like I just kind of pull it out of my ass, and it's like a very like intuitive process. But I think because it is, hopefully, at least in my intention, it is kind of challenging to listen to sometimes. Maybe not so much in a negative way, more just like, oh, this is weird, I don't know how to define this. Like it's not necessarily, it sounds like electronic music, but it's not, EDM necessarily, or trap, or like there's a lot of influences kind of meshed together. So I think it's maybe challenging people, and just being like alien as fuck.
I think that's a good kind of message or like theme, because I think being alien, being the outsider, being whatever that's not in the box, I think there is a certain kind of beauty in that. And the more people talk about it, or like encourage people to be like one, then I think people will be a lot more happy, and the world could be better. Because I don't think we need to live in a world where everyone is in that box, or like whatever box that other people try to make them be in. You could be in your own box as long as the box you created. It doesn't matter. You could be still in the box. In my opinion, other people are like, it's always out of the box is better. But as long as it's the box that you're comfortable and happy with, it doesn't matter. And I think your kind of content, a lot of things I see is like where like you're giving in people content that shows that it's okay to be out of the box. It's okay to be unique, be the outsider, be that alien, and still have fun and enjoy yourself. I think there's a lot of like joy, at least from your music. I feel a lot of joy, even though it's like, oh, it's not EDM, it's not dance or whatever it may be. It's still nice to hear and listen to, and like just have fun with it. And that's what I get when I listen to your music. And you talk a lot about like influences and stuff. Can you just talk about your influences for like your different mediums? Like, because I assume there could be one that's influences all your art stuff, but then are there specific, well, this is for my photography, this is my visual art, this is for me music. Can you just talk about those influences and how they impacted you?
Yeah, I have like a ton of influences. I would say like visually, I really, really was affected by and influenced by Tim Burton's old films. They still are very intriguing to me. Not so much like the newer stuff, but films like The Nightmare Before Christmas is like my all-time favorite movie. Edward Scissorhands, Batman, like these are the movies that I was watching as a kid, and they really, really impacted me. I think a lot of visual influences are also like comic books, like I mentioned, Jim Lee. There was a comic called The Max that I was like obsessed with. And God, there's so many photographers I like, but in particular, David LaChapelle, who also directed some music videos, and he's a really famous portrait photographer. His work, I wouldn't say like wasn't the only influence, but it was a huge influence on just taking photos of people, because that's like what my photographic work primarily is composed of, like portraiture and conceptual portraiture. David LaChapelle is amazing for that. And when it comes to music, I mean, there's so many I can think of. I love Yellow Magic Orchestra. I love Kraftwerk. I love Wendy Carlos. Like I would say Wendy Carlos, the music that she made for A Clockwork Orange, and the music like Switched on Bach was like a really, really influential record, just like the intersection of classical music with electronic music. But then I also listened to a lot of punk music and heavy metal and death metal and stuff. So I don't know, like the answer is very complex, but I listen to a lot of stuff. I take in a lot of content. I love like furniture design. I love architecture. Like I just try to be a sponge for a lot of different kinds of stuff. But usually it's stuff that's just kind of wacky and just very, again, just like that challenge is something that I crave. Like if I feel comfortable ingesting it, it's boring to me. Like I kind of forget what it is or I don't care, But if something like stops me in my tracks, like Billie Eilish was one a couple of years ago when she came out with her album, where when we all go to sleep, where do we go? There we go. But yeah, like stuff like that like stops me in my place and it's like, whoa, this person thinks not only way outside of the box, but kind of like you said, they created their own box. And even you can tell they're kind of like not even comfortable with that, like they're just going to keep going and going and going. But yeah, my influences are all over. I could talk about that for another hour, but I'll try to keep it chill.
That's great. And you mentioned like you consume a lot of content, you're a sponge. And this question I'm asking you now is kind of something I've been thinking a lot about just for myself and to other creators, because being a content creator, or at least really into the content creating, you have to look at content, listen to content, all that stuff all the time and critique it, or just look at what works and what doesn't. But then that kind of maybe potentially takes away from you just enjoying the content that you consume at the same time. How do you kind of handle that? Because I'm sure you look at lots of art, listen to lots of music, watches a lot of videos, but then you also create content yourself. How do you make sure like you don't get like kind of not necessarily jaded, but like you're like tired, or like just balances out where you can still enjoy consuming content while still creating at the same time?
That's a really hard question to answer, because I do ingest a lot of content and I do have a very like analytical mind. A lot of times, especially with music, for example, I'll be in real time, I'll be listening to a song, and instead of enjoying it, I'll be actually picking it apart in my head. Oh, here's how they made the drums. Here's how they probably produced the vocals. Oh, they moved it over to the left. I can hear, especially with music, I'm like super analytical. So I think honestly, one of the only times I can really just stop and just like enjoy something is when something is just completely bizarre or out of this world, where I can't even think, I can't even start to imagine how they made it. For example, death metal music, which is something very dear to my heart. It's kind of it's not even a secret, but like I'm like a huge metalhead. I love death metal music, and death metal is one of the only genres of music where I don't stop to think about how it was produced and technically how did they do this, because it's so intense and it's just so like bizarre and so extreme that I can actually just kind of enjoy it as music and just be like, yes, this is amazing. Yes, yes, yes. But when it comes to like electronic music, I enjoy a lot of it. Don't get me wrong, but I'm constantly just like, oh, here's how they did this. I really want to know how they did this. Like it's hard to turn that analytical part of my brain off. But YouTube is kind of easier because it's more kind of like you're hanging out with people or something. Like it has more of that kind of personal edge. And a lot of the times, like, how they filmed it or something is a lot more transparent than something like music, which can be cloaked in a lot of different ways. So YouTube is kind of the easiest thing for me to actually ingest, I would say. I watch a lot of YouTube videos, and I love watching the different personalities and stuff like that. I can switch off that analytical part of myself with YouTube for some reason. And maybe because it's like a huge part of my life, and I'm just kind of like so sick of being like, how did they take this apart? Like I'm just like, shut up, Ben, just watch it. Yeah. So I don't know. It's hard to just enjoy media, honestly, but I'm constantly like critiquing it and trying to figure out how did they do this. So it's hard.
It's a nice perspective, and I wouldn't have guessed like, oh, you just tune out and just listen to death metal and not have to worry about anything. Like you could like death metal, but I would have thought, oh, you would have critiqued it as well because you're interested in the whole music side of things. But you're like, no, I just listen to it because it's intense. It's just out of this world kind of thing, which is great. I'm happy to hear that. And as I was doing research for this episode, I just go through your content and all this stuff. A few things kind of like really spoke to me, or like I really want to talk to you about it. Is what one of the things would be like, I saw something where it's like, you talk about feel everything. What
Yes.
does that really mean? Like feel everything. Obviously, we know what it is in terms of like listening to it, like the two words. But for you, is there a different meaning, or it's just what it is?
Yeah, it's actually, for me, it has a little bit of a history. So I'll tell you a little story. So where that phrase entered my life, so I was married. I was in a relationship for 12 years, and my ex, he passed away of cancer. In going into our 12th year of our relationship, he had pancreatic cancer, and it was like extremely traumatic for me. It still is. It was only, well, not, I say only, but it still feels like it was yesterday. But it was about almost 6 years ago already. In August, it'll be 6 years, which is kind of crazy. But after he passed away, I was like super in grief, and I was just like, oh my God, this is like the worst things ever happened to me. And I was on his computer. His name was Gary, and I was on his computer, and I saw this thing on the desktop that was just like a blog post. And I was like, he didn't even have a blog. So it's like he was writing something. I was like, oh, what's this? Um, and it ended up being this blog post. And then the first words I saw in it were feel everything. And then he talked about how falling in love was like jumping out of a plane. And you just never know where it's going to go. And you have to take that risk sometimes, but it's incredibly scary. But if you feel all that stuff, you could have the most exhilarating ride of your life, or you could die, but you don't know if you try. So that's kind of the quick backstory, very, very quick backstory about how those two words kind of enter my life. But the way I interpret it now is those two words have helped me a lot with my own grief and my grieving process. For example, we're kind of taught, at least in American culture, like when you like don't cry, you should almost have shame for showing too much emotion, or people will be called snowflake for feeling too much or being too sensitive or whatever. I'm a totally sensitive person. Like I'm not shy about showing my emotion, especially after losing Gary, and like I lost both of my parents a couple of years after that. And I've just had a lot of very close death in my life, and feel everything has really helped me with the grief, to really feel something and to take the time to be like, what does sadness actually feel like? No, I don't want to look at my phone. I don't want to, kind of say that I'm not having these emotions, or try to act tough and be like, no, I can get through this. I'm going to push through something else or push this aside. It's like, no, actually stop what you're doing if you can, and just really feel what that feeling is, whether it's sadness, whether it's grief, or it's happiness or joy. I think a lot of times it also relates for me with like how we use our devices and our phones, and how we're constantly on social media and that kind of stuff, kind of all these interactions and stuff. When do we actually take the time to like stop what we're doing and just like feel, or just like close our eyes and be kind of aware and conscious of what's going on in our minds and in our hearts in that moment? So I guess that's my way of saying feel everything means like the whole kind of spectrum of your emotions, from happy to sad and everything in between, or even around it, or unexplored stuff. Just like feel stuff, like really feel it. And that's what makes me feel kind of more alive. And it actually helps me with a lot of mental health issues and that kind of stuff. And just like situations, like actually feeling it versus putting it aside. I'm kind of done with putting stuff aside.
Yeah. That's great. And I can feel like that kind of or vibe from all the content you put out, because every time I see your content, from like the pictures on Instagram to your music, it's always feel like, oh, there's a lot of emotion in it. There's a lot of feelings that I could feel. It might not be what you intended for me to feel, but I feel those, and I feel it's nice. And like, I think people need to embrace that more, or I'm also trying to embrace like accepting whatever feelings I do have, and I'd be like, it's okay, it's fine. Don't have to push it away, kind of thing. Just let it. It depends on how you want to deal with it at the end once you have those feelings, but everyone have their own way of dealing with it. And yeah, it will definitely help with mental health for sure. And another thing I picked up, it's just keywords that I see in your content is like, you mentioned broken English. Can you just talk about like the meaning of that, or like just what does it, like why is it in your content that you mentioned it?
Yeah, the broken English thing is in relation to being Asian for sure. And I did an illustration called Broken English before. I was just thinking about my mom's experience actually, and just thinking about those two terms, or like when they're put together, it's like, what makes language broken? And how does that feel for somebody to receive that information if they are described as having that? And my mom, even though she lived in America for, she's like almost or about 40 years, she still had quote unquote broken English. And people would describe that as like, oh, does she speak English? Does she speak English? No, but she speaks broken English, and like, I already think that sounds condescending and just kind of wrong. And, it always made me feel kind of protective of my mom, that I needed to like, tell people like, hey, that's not cool, this and that. So I'm not sure exactly what inspired that piece when I came up with that, with that illustration, which is basically the words. I think it just says like broken English or English. I actually can't remember my own word, but it's a piece in which it looks shattered, like the words are shattered, as if someone just like smashed a mirror with their fist or something. So there's a bit of that kind of rage and anger, and just thinking about racism, just thinking about not just being Asian, but anybody that doesn't sound fully American or fully Canadian or whatever it is. It's like, what makes something broken, and why is it broken just because it doesn't sound the quote unquote right way or something. So it's just weird. You hear stuff about people saying stuff about your mom and you're just like I love my mom. My mom is like the sweetest, gentlest person. Like, how could you even say anything negative about her? It's like I would feel guilty even having a thought like that. She was so like humble. So it's just kind of protected. That kind of rage and anger, I guess, was in that piece in particular.
And you talking about like, the whole being Asian, the racism and the anger and all that stuff, the negative feelings, just brings me back to like I guess 2020, when the whole like anti-Asian hate, all that stuff that's been really brewing, all that stuff. I saw on your in your Instagram and stuff, you had things to say about it, obviously. And can you just talk about like your overall thoughts at that time and how you feel about it now and all that stuff? Your thoughts on like, the issues at hand.
Yeah, I mean, I was definitely very upset and like scared, and I had a lot of fear, anxiety. I mean, you name it. I mean, it was a very like dark period of my life for sure, because I already had those feelings for a long time. It's not like I don't have to explain this to anyone who's Asian. Like, we have to deal with this shit our whole lives, unfortunately, for the most part, unless we're in Asia. But if you're not in Asia, you're in America or Canada or whatever, like you're going to be othered. You're going to be constantly othered. And I guess I was so kind of fearful and upset that I was like, you know what, screw it. I'm going to start talking about this, because I can't just like sit here and just let this go, or be the not the token Asian. What's that term? Model minority. Thank you. Like I think I even discussed that in one of the videos. I did these kind of like live Instagram things, something that I never did before. I don't talk a lot about mental health or that kind of thing in a lot of my content, but in that moment, I was like, I don't see a lot of people just talking about their own experiences. I see a lot of these kind of cutesy Instagram posts like how to deal with anti-Asian hate, and like these kind of, and like while I'm like really grateful that people were talking about that and are talking about it, I was still just like, yeah, but that's not enough for me. As an Asian person, when you look like this, we need more support and empathy and sympathy than just some cute Instagram posts. Like, that's not enough for me. So I think that was the main kind of drive, was to talk about my pain and to talk about my struggle, and in a way that I'd never talked about before. Most like to kind of let it out, but also for as like a healing thing for me, and hopefully other people that dealt with that same kind of abuse, or still deals with that same kind of abuse, and just like blatant racism, and just being like, yo, why is it okay for people to still talk shit about Asians? Like, now y'all are all of a sudden standing up. Like, this is not a new concept, even talking about it now, I'm like starting to get upset. But like, yeah, it was just like, yeah, again, just like letting out, it's kind of like the broken English thing, just like letting out that rage that had been sitting there for way too long, and hopefully kind of teaching people and educating people a little bit too, and letting other Asian people know, like, we should be talking about this. We can't sit on the sidelines and just be like, oh no, it sucks, but I'm okay. No, like, we're not okay. And it's okay to talk about that. We should talk about that, or else nobody will know, So, and yeah.
I think, like you mentioned, it's okay to be angry. It's okay to speak out. And yes. I think we're so used to we're Asian. We don't want to make others feel uncomfortable. But at this point, yes. we can't think with that mindset, or else literally because they are comfortable, because of how we make it, it affects our lives and like makes our life miserable. And I don't think we can do that anymore, because no one's gonna stand up for us so that we could be a little more comfortable, be better, right?
Yeah.
We can't always think of the other side at this point. We have to think of our own as well. That's how I see it with the whole anti-Asian hate and everything that's going on, right? And it's fine to be angry because things are being shitty. So,
like, we should be angry. And you know what's weird about that too? When I started talking about this stuff, I had a few friends, like really good friends, like basically like my best friends in this world. And I don't hold it against them, but one of them was like, I had no idea that you dealt with this kind of stuff. And I was like, I was like, oh my God, I just wanted to like,
yeah.
my head was like about to explode. But I was just like, I think that's what happens, is that it becomes this kind of invisible plague, you know? And I also wanted to kind of use that spotlight that we were weirdly getting, which also made me very uncomfortable as well. You know, to find, it's like, oh, finally people are talking about anti-Asian racism. Here's the spotlight. And I was kind of just like, I don't want the spotlight. Like, get that spotlight away from, like, I don't want to speak for other Asians, but I was just like, no, I don't want that. But I was also like, maybe people will listen this time. You know, maybe this is an important moment for us. And I think it is. And I think it was, and it still is. And I don't know, like, hopefully it led to a lot of people just learning how to empathize, or just to open their minds a little bit and maybe stop talking so much and listen to other people, even their good friends, that they're like, I didn't know you went through this. It's like, you should have, you should have at this point. Like, racism is a thing. And if you don't know about that, that's a huge privilege. That please, like, try to accept that, like, see how that affects you, and, you know, educate yourself and learn to empathize and sympathize with people who are struggling. So
yeah, I don't know if you felt the same way, but for me, the most frustrating part about like the whole anti-Asian hate and all that, like, kind of racism and stuff, it's just all this is happening, but at the same time, you know, Asian media, Asian culture, Asian anything is being more popular each and every day in the West.
yes.
But yet, so it makes me feel like we're not any better than, we're only good for our products, for our kind of capitalistic kind of thing. We don't matter as people. Like, you
Actual people.
love us for what we can produce, what we create, what we have, that we could have you consume, and that's it. And that's kind of that. No, that's not kind of fucked up. That is fucked up.
Absolutely. It's like K-pop, I think, is like maybe the biggest example in the world, especially in America. It's like absolutely gigantic. You know, BTS, bigger than Rihanna or whatever, like that kind of thing. Yeah, and I 100% agree with you. It's incredibly frustrating. Not to mention all of the cultural appropriation of Asian culture, Chinese, Japanese, Indian, Korean, like all different types of Asian cultures that are just blatantly copied, and just, you know, by other cultures. And like, at the same time, we're getting, you know, killed. So it's like you're saying, it's like, that doesn't add up. Like, we're not here just to make Squid Game and then have a nice night, but then you can talk shit about Asians. Like, that doesn't make sense, you know? So I think it's really important. Like, you're doing this podcast, I think that's a huge part of it as well. You know, like, all these things that we do that add up to kind of the Asian experience, that will hopefully let people know, like, we're so much more than just, we're not here to just entertain y'all. Like, yeah, we're entertaining, we're cute and stuff like that. We can't help it. But at the same time, like, there's so much more to our culture than just, you know, the cool BTS commercial you just saw, and like, oh, you love K-pop? That's cool. Do you have any Korean friends though? Like, is there something beyond the surface level? That's something that I still think about. So yeah, I 100% agree with you.
Yeah. And hopefully we can move towards something more uplifting, or like more happy, I guess. I just want to highlight another thing that I've noticed in terms of your content. You did Asians, the photo series of LGBTQ plus Asian Pacific Islanders. I thought that was really cool. Can you just talk about that? What it is, why you did it, and like, no, tell people about it.
Yeah, so it's a The Asians is a photo series. It's ongoing, and it's all photographs, portraits of queer LGBTQIA plus Asians and Pacific Islanders, and it happened. I mentioned earlier that there was an art show that was at the Asian American Resource Center here in Austin, Texas. So it was actually like a city grant that they got this funding to like produce an event at the Asian American Resource Center in Austin. And they asked me what my theme should be, and I was like, well, how about like queer Asians? Like again, it's like a spotlight kind of thing. It's like the city wants to see Asian experience. So I was like, well, here's a community that I am part of that feels very underrepresented or just not represented at all in popular culture, especially. So I just kind of talked to some friends, and through a lot of communication, just found people that were in my community here in Austin, a lot of whom I had no idea. I'd never met them before until I did this project. And I would just do a photo and just be like, hey, if you know anybody else that you think might be interested in being photographed, let them know. And I ended up doing, I think I'm up to like 17 or 18 different portraits. There were, I think 16 or 15 that were actually produced as like large format, kind of huge photographs. And I specifically zoomed into the faces, just like basically from the neck up, just like a very close in shot. And the person's looking right at you. And it's the idea of visibility, kind of like the underrepresentation of Asian and like the non-representation of queer Asian in particular, but kind of to force people to look right into our eyes and be like, we are here too. It's like the whole, like, we're queer, we're here, like that kind of thing, except for a community that even within the queer and, the gay community, even in that community is very misrepresented or very underrepresented or very tokenized or fetishized in a lot of ways, So that was kind of my way to be like, I'm going to celebrate, my community. And I also met like a lot of really cool people that I'm still friends with. We have like this group chat and stuff. So it's just cool to like form this community kind of by accident. Or not form it, but just like find a community of people that I personally needed and, and really adore now. But also, yeah, I'm still producing these works. It's just COVID kind of messed it up a little bit. Cause like, we're trying to be safe and all that stuff. I don't have to explain that, but so I haven't done any of those since COVID. I haven't really taken almost any photographs of people since COVID started, but I definitely want to get back into it because I've met some more people through Instagram and stuff who have seen the works and been like, hey, I would love to pose for you. I live in Dallas or I live in, Houston or whatever, other places in Texas, places where you wouldn't think like, oh, there's a queer Asian community. What? So I like the idea of kind of subverting that idea and being like, not just we're queer and we're here, but like we happen to also be in Texas where you may not expect for them to be a lot of us here, but here we are and we're thriving too. And here we are. Deal with it.
That's great. And you talk about like making this series so that, the queer Asian community can be more visible for mainstream, for all that, so that you're out here and everywhere, any place that you can imagine kind of thing. So you're talking about like the visibility aspect, like obviously there can be a lot more representation with the whole queer Asian community and such. So you being a part of it, what would you say is like things that, or how should I word it? What would you hope the representation can come out in the future be like? What things you want to highlight more specifically, or maybe struggles or anything that you want people to be more aware of? Because so far it's just a lot of time people just don't know. It's not that they don't care, they just don't know.
I think it's kind of the duality of the experience there's a lot of things, but I think I would sum it up as kind of this. It's not only that we're Asian, which as we know we're a threat. Asian people are a threat to racists, and we're othered and we're tokenized and that kind of stuff. But when there's also the layer of queerness on top of that, I think that's what I want to kind of highlight, or at least bring out, in unexpected ways, and just like the visibility of the queer plus the Asian. Like Asian alone is hard enough, but the queer, like, and also is like queerness alone, in my experience, is also incredibly challenging as well. Those two things together is just like we're almost like a double threat, like it's if someone doesn't like Asians, oh, what if they find out they're queer too? Oh my God, oh, what am I gonna like their head's gonna explode or whatever. So I think it's like the idea of like showing that, like displaying that duality, or I guess like not the duality necessarily, because they're not necessarily opposing, but they're more together at this. It's more like a layered, like showing that layered existence and highlighting its beauty, showing the diversity within the community as well. Like we don't all look, you know, a certain way. Like some of us are mixed, some of us are just from all over the place, you know, darker skin tones, lighter skin tones, different eye shapes, and you know, everything is, it's so diverse just within different Asian countries. So and Pacific Islander communities. So I guess it's like showing that and highlighting the beauty, but also making people think that like there's so many other struggles and lifestyles that go along with the queerness aspect of it as well, that is completely not represented in culture. Even there's even actors that are starting to get, you know, some movies and stuff, you know, like Aquafina, you know, Bowen Yang in SNL, stuff like that. And that's amazing. I'm like, and Margaret Cho, I'm like so excited about that. But I'm just like, what took y'all so long? Like, we've been here for so long. We didn't just pop up and like, oh, we needed an Asian person for Saturday Night Live, you know? So it's like, I don't know, getting out some of that frustration, but also highlighting the beauty and the diversity in our community. Yeah.
And I would say it'll be nice to be where like when they do talk about all Asians that also happen to be queer, it won't be just highlight one particular part. Like,
right,
they're that Asian person, or like it's that queer. I often find like if they're Asian and queer, they often highlight one thing more than the other. When no,
yeah,
their identity is a combination of both. Like I feel like, at least from what I've seen, a lot of times Bowen Yang in like media, it's often he's talk about he's the Asian guy, or he's the queer person. Like there's no like he's Asian queer. Like I don't know why that would be. I guess it's just different media, how they want to talk about the story. But I think both identity for him is equally important, if not like his whole life, right? So I hope like they don't I don't want to say discredit, but I was in a sense like don't forget, like, you know, everyone has many facets of their life that needs to be highlighted as well.
Right.
And it's been a really good time talking to you, learn a lot. And thank you for sharing your story. And for the listeners who want to know more about you, follow your content, watch your content, listen to your music, see your pictures, photography, where can they find all of that?
Yeah, so basically look up Ben Aqua. Aqua is spelled like the color, AQUA, on YouTube, Instagram, Twitter. You know, I'm on all the major social media outlets. So yeah, just look up Ben Aqua. Follow me, hit me up, slide into my DMs.
Yeah. Again, thank you so much for taking the time out to talk to me and share your story, and all the best to you in 2022 and beyond.
Yes, you too. Thank you so much for having me, Kyle.